There is a city built into the side of a cliff in southwestern Colorado, and for about 600 years, almost nobody outside knew it was there. It sits back inside a great hollow in the rock, a natural alcove scooped out of a canyon wall, and inside that hollow, somebody stacked up rooms and towers and round sunken chambers until the whole recess was full of stone building. We call it Cliff Palace now. It is the largest structure of its kind on the continent, 150 rooms, and 23 of those round chambers packed into a single cave in a wall, and the people who made it did it entirely by hand, with no metal tools, no wheel, and no animal stronger than a dog to help them carry the load. I want to be careful with this from the very first minute, because the cliff dwellings are exactly the kind of thing that gets turned into a ghost story the moment they leave the canyon. So let me put the record on the table right away, before I tell you anything, so you know where every piece of this is coming from. The place is a national park, Mesa Verde, run and studied by the National Park Service, and the ruins have been documented for well over a century. Cliff Palace was found by two ranchers in the winter of 1888, a man named Richard Wetherill and his brother-in-law Charlie Mason, out on the mesa looking for stray cattle. And the first careful scientific study of these dwellings was done a few years after that, in the early 1890s, by a young Swedish scientist named Gustaf Nordenskjöld, who published it as a book in 1893. Real place, real record, real names, with dates attached to them. That is the ground we are standing on. Here is the tension I could not get out of my head while I was reading, and it is the reason for this whole video. These people built that. They shaped a stone city into a cliff. They farmed the desert on the tabletop above it. They engineered water in a place that barely has any. And then, in the space of about a single generation, the whole region emptied out. The buildings stopped, the alcoves went quiet, and the canyons stayed silent for 600 years until two cowboys rode up on them in the snow. The title of this video says they vanished, and I kept that word on purpose, because that is the word everyone reaches for. But I'll show you that vanished is the one word the record will not actually let us use, and that what really happened is stranger, and honestly better, than a disappearance. Before we go any further, I owe you one correction, right up front, because it matters. You have probably heard these people called the Anasazi, and that is the word in the title. It is a Navajo word, and it was borrowed and spread by outsiders. The trouble is that it is not their word for themselves, and it does not mean anything flattering. It comes down to something close to ancestors of our enemies, and the living descendants of these builders find it offensive. The term the Pueblo peoples prefer, and the one archaeologists now use, is ancestral Puebloan. Ancestral, because these are somebody's ancestors, a point that is going to turn out to be the entire ending of this story. I'll use both words here, the title word and the truer one, and I will try to use them both with respect. So here is the plan, and it comes in two halves. First, we build the city. I'll walk you through exactly how they carved a town into a cliff, stone by stone, and how they fed it, because the engineering is the part that gets skipped in favor of the spooky ending, and it is genuinely staggering. Then, only after you have seen what they made, we deal with the leaving. And when we get to the leaving, I will stop and mark the line out loud, the exact place where the hard, measurable archaeology ends and the interpretation begins, because that seam is where every honest version of this story lives and every dishonest one blurs it. Start with the cliff itself, because the cliff is why any of this exists. Mesa Verde is a high, flat tableland, and its canyons are cut into a pale rock called cliff house sandstone. That sandstone was laid down when this part of the world sat under an ancient shoreline, and it has a useful weakness. Water seeps down through the porous stone from the mesa top, and when it reaches a harder layer it cannot pass. It spreads sideways and pools. In winter that trapped water freezes, and freezing water expands, and slab by slab, over a very long time, it pries loose great sheets of the cliff face and drops them away. What is left behind, where the rock has fallen out, is a smooth, curved hollow set back into the wall, an alcove. A stone room the size of a building, with a roof and a back and a floor, made by nothing but water and frost and time. The builders did not carve those hollows. The canyon handed them the hollows, already made, and they moved in. And that is the first thing to understand about the engineering. It began with reading the rock. These alcoves face in different directions, and the good ones, the ones that got the big villages, tend to open toward the winter sun, so that the low southern light of the cold months reaches deep into the shelter and warms the stone, while the high summer sun passes over the top and leaves it shaded. That is not a small observation. That is a people who watched exactly where the sun sat on the shortest and the longest days of the year, and then chose their alcove accordingly, so the cliff itself would heat their homes in winter and cool them in summer. Before a single stone was stacked, the site was already doing half the work. And there is a puzzle hidden in that choice, one worth planting now because it comes back at the end. These people had not always lived in the cliffs. For most of the centuries they spent on Mesa Verde, 700 years all told, they lived up on the open top of the mesa, first in pit houses dug down into the ground, and later in above-ground villages of stone and mud, out in the sun and the wind, right next to their fields. The cliff dwellings, the ones that made this place famous, belong only to the very end of that long run. They went up in the last 75 to 100 years before the leaving, roughly across the 1200s. Which means that after generations of living comfortably up top, an entire population climbed down off the tableland and wedged their homes into hollows in the canyon walls, hollows that were darker, more cramped, and a genuine daily labor to get in and out of. People do not usually take on that much extra hardship for no reason. Hold that question. Why come down into the cliffs at all? So late, so suddenly. It is going to matter. Now the stone. Walk up to a wall in one of these dwellings, and the first surprise is how regular it is. These are not piled rocks. They are shaped blocks, sandstone cut and ground into rough rectangles, laid in courses like brick. The builders quarried the stone right there from the canyon, and they shaped each block by hand, pecking and grinding it with harder hammerstones they carried up from the riverbeds below, because there was no metal in this world at all, not a chisel, not a saw. Every face on every block was dressed by hitting one stone with another stone, thousands and thousands of times. Then the blocks were set in mortar, and the mortar tells you something too. It was made from the local soil mixed with water and ash, packed into the joints, and into the gaps of that soft mortar they pressed small chips of stone, little wedges the archaeologists call chinking, to lock the whole wall tight and keep it from settling. Some of the walls were then finished with a smooth coat of earthen plaster, and traces of the color still cling to them, pinks and browns and reds and yellows and white. These were not gray ruins when they were alive. They were plastered and painted, and people decorated the rooms they lived in. Think about what that labor actually was. No wheel, so nothing rolls. No draft animals, so nothing gets pulled but by human muscle. No metal, so every block is shaped by stone on stone. Every beam that roofs these rooms is a whole tree, felled with a stone axe up on the mesa, trimmed and carried down into the canyon and up into the alcove on somebody's back and shoulders, and they did not build one small shelter. In Cliff Palace they built 150 rooms. They stacked them 2 and 3, and in places 4 stories high, fitting the rising walls up under the curve of the alcove roof, working the whole structure into a space that was never square and never level, a space that sloped and bulged the way a natural hollow in a cliff does. To build straight and strong inside a crooked cave, entirely by eye, entirely by hand, is an act of engineering that would give a modern crew real trouble, and they did it with hammerstones and baskets. And then there are the round rooms, the ones that make people assume something mystical is going on, so let me be plain about what they are. Sunk into the floors of these villages are circular chambers, dug down below ground level and walled and roofed, and you entered them by a ladder down through a hole in the top. Cliff Palace has 23 of them. The word for them is kiva. A kiva was a room for ceremony and for gathering, the ritual and social heart of a household or a clan, and many of them have the same careful features repeated from village to village. A fire pit in the center, a low wall or a deflector to keep the draft off the fire, a ventilation shaft cut through the wall to pull fresh air down and in, a genuine piece of ventilation engineering built into a room dug into the ground, and set into the floor, often, a small round hole. To the descendants of these people, that small hole carries a deep meaning about emergence, about the people coming up into this world from a world below, and I am leaving that idea exactly there, on the surface, reported and not pried open, because it belongs to them and not to me. What I will tell you as fact is the architecture. The kiva is real. You can climb down into one today. The ventilation shaft works. That much is stone you can measure. Step back and look at the scale of the thing. Because Cliff Palace was not alone, and it was not even typical. Across Mesa Verde, there are about 600 cliff dwellings tucked into these canyon walls, and more than 5,000 recorded archaeological sites in the park all told. But here is the detail that reframes the whole place. 3/4 of those 600 cliff dwellings are tiny. They hold 1 to 5 rooms. They are a single family's rooms in a small hollow. A home, not a monument. Cliff Palace is the giant here, the rare exception, and the Park Service reads it as something closer to a social and administrative center, a place of gathering with heavy ceremonial use, for a whole community spread through the surrounding canyons. So do not picture a lost city standing alone in the desert. Picture a populated countryside, hundreds of stone homesteads worked into the cliffs, across miles of canyon, with a few great houses like Cliff Palace anchoring it. This was a neighborhood. About 100 people lived in Cliff Palace itself, and thousands more lived within a walk of it. But the cliff dwellings are only half of the engineering, and honestly the less impressive half, because the part that kept everyone alive was not down in the shady alcove at all. It was up on top. Mesa Verde means green table in Spanish, and the name is a clue. The flat mesa top above the canyons is where the soil is, a fine wind-blown soil good for farming, and that is where the fields were. These were farmers first and cliff builders second. They grew corn above all, along with beans and squash, the 3 crops that carried nearly every farming people of this continent, and they grew them in a place that gets very little rain and gives it up grudgingly. And that split, the fields up on the tabletop and the homes down in the cliff, meant that daily life here was lived on a vertical. To get from your rooms in the alcove up to the corn, you climbed, and not on a stair. Set into the bare rock of these canyon walls are handholds and toeholds, small shallow cups pecked into the stone with those same hammerstones, a ladder cut straight into a cliff face. People went up and down those toeholds every single day, and not empty-handed. They carried water up, and firewood, and baskets of corn, and infants tied to their backs, on a climb that would stop most of us cold today. Whatever else these were, they were not a soft people. The commute alone was mountaineering, so they engineered the water. This is dry country, a semi-arid tableland where a crop can fail for want of a single rain, and the record on the mesa is a record of people fighting that problem with real ingenuity for centuries. Down the shallow drainages where runoff gathered after a storm, they built check dams, low walls of stone laid across the slope to slow the water down as it ran, so that instead of tearing away downhill it backed up, sank in, and dropped its load of soil behind the wall. Each little dam caught a patch of moist earth, and those caught patches became terraces, small held gardens stepping down the drainage. On the mesa top they built reservoirs, basins to collect and hold water against the dry stretch, work substantial enough that engineers still study them. This is a civilization that looked at a desert and did not simply endure it. It plumbed it. It read exactly where the water wanted to go and put stone in its path to keep it. And it fed a lot of people. Nobody can count the dead precisely, but archaeologists estimating from how much farmland the mesa and its region could work believe the wider population ran into the tens of thousands at its height. That many people, farming corn on a high desert table, drinking from reservoirs they built, living in stone towns in the cliffs below their fields. That is the city. Now, before we deal with why it emptied, we have to talk about how we know any of it, because the how of the knowing is where the trust in this story either holds or falls apart. And it starts with those 2 cowboys in the snow. In December of 1888, Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason were riding the top of Mesa Verde, looking for cattle that had wandered off. The story, as it comes down, is that they came to the edge of a canyon in blowing snow and looked across, and there in the far wall, back in a great alcove, was what Wetherill described as a magnificent city in the rock. They had ridden up on Cliff Palace. Within about a day, they had found more, the sites we now call Spruce Tree House and Square Tower House, more silent stone towns in the cliffs. The Wetherill family spent years after that exploring the dwellings, and, it has to be said, digging through them, and selling what they found, because there was no law yet that said you could not, and the early history of this place is tangled up with pot hunting and loss as much as with discovery. I won't pretend the ranchers were careful scientists. They were not, but they were the ones who opened the door. The careful science arrived in 1891, in the person of Gustaf Nordenskjöld. He was young, in his early 20s, a Swede from a family of famous scientists, and he came through Colorado and got pulled in by these ruins completely. He stayed with the Wetherills at their ranch, and he did something nobody had done here before. He treated the cliff dwellings as an archaeological problem instead of a treasure chest. He excavated in an orderly way, he photographed the sites, more than 150 photographs, he mapped and he recorded, and he even taught Richard Wetherill some of the method, how to handle a trowel, why writing down where a thing was found matters as much as the thing itself. And in 1893, he published the first real scientific account of Mesa Verde, a book called The Cliff Dwellers of the Mesa Verde, describing the buildings and the pottery and the tools in careful detail. It is the foundation the whole modern study sits on. And it cost him. When Nordenskjöld tried to ship the artifacts he had excavated back to Europe, the town of Durango stopped him. He was arrested, held on the accusation that he was looting and devastating the ruins, even though, as everyone soon discovered, there was no actual law on the books that his digging had broken. He was let go after about a month, cleared, and his collection did leave the country. It went to Europe and eventually into the National Museum of Finland, on the other side of an ocean from the canyon it came out of, and it stayed there for more than a century. Nordenskjöld himself did not get old. He died in 1895, only 26 years old, a few years after the summer that made his name. And then, more than 120 years after all of that, something happened that I think is the quiet key to this whole story, and I want you to hold it against the word vanished. The museum in Finland, working with the Pueblo tribes and with Mesa Verde, agreed to send the ancestral human remains and the sacred objects back, and they came home, across that same ocean, to the descendants of the people they had been taken from. Sit with what that act requires to even be possible. You cannot repatriate the dead of a vanished people. There has to be someone on the other end to receive them, someone who can stand up and say, "Those are our ancestors, give them back." There was. There is. The remains left a canyon in Colorado in the 1890s as the property of a vanished race, and they returned in our own time to living relatives who were still there to claim them. The whole ghost story quietly falls apart on that one fact alone, and we have not even reached the archaeology of the leaving yet. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I keep laying down these names on purpose, the same way I would with any real history, because the names are the receipts. Wetherill and Mason and the cattle, Nordenskjöld and the trowel and the arrest and the book, a national park, a museum in Helsinki, and exact years you can check. That specificity is the whole difference between history and a campfire tale. When somebody sells you the spooky version of the cliff dwellings, watch what happens to the names. They dissolve. It all melts into a lost race and a vanished people, and nobody knows. But the record is the opposite of vague. It is full of names and dates, right up until you reach the one set of names it genuinely does not have. Because for all of this documentation, the record does not tell us what the builders called themselves, or the name of a single person who shaped a block or set a beam in Cliff Palace. Those men and women left us an entire city and not one signature. Where the record is silent like that, I'm not going to invent a name to fill the quiet. I'm just going to tell you it is quiet. Now we come to the seam, and I promised I would mark it out loud, so here it is. Everything I have told you up to this point is the hard kind of fact. The alcove is a measurable hollow in a measurable rock. The walls are shaped sandstone you can stand inside and count. The check dams are still on the mesa. The book was printed and shelved, and you can still open it. None of that requires you to take anyone's word beyond what a tape measure and a printing press can prove. What comes next, the question of why they left, is a different kind of statement entirely. You cannot touch it the way you can touch a wall. It is an interpretation, argued over by careful people who do not fully agree, and built out of clues rather than hard certainties. So from here on, I mark it out loud every time we cross from what the stone shows to what the scholars think, because the leaving is exactly the ground where this story usually gets lied about, in both directions. And the first thing the record gives us about the leaving is not a reason, it is a clock. It turns out we can date the wood in these buildings with astonishing precision, and the tool for that is one of the quiet miracles of 20th century science. Early in the 1900s, an astronomer named Andrew Ellicott Douglas, who was actually studying sunspots and how the sun affects climate, worked out that a tree lays down one ring a year, and that the rings run wide in a wet year and narrow in a dry one. Which means every tree carries a barcode of the exact seasons it lived through. Match the pattern of rings in an old beam to the pattern in a slightly older beam, and then to an older one still, and you can chain the record backward year by year until you can point at a single ring and say, that ring grew in this exact calendar year. Douglas built that chain, and dendrochronology, tree ring dating, was born, and the American Southwest, with its dry preserving air and its wooden beams, became the perfect place to use it. So pointed at Mesa Verde. Those roof beams the builders carried up on their backs are datable, each one, to the year the tree was cut. And when you read the dates off the beams across all these dwellings, a pattern jumps out that is almost unbearable to look at. The building goes on, right through the 1200s, beam after beam, year after year, and then it stops. The very last tree felled for construction anywhere on the mesa was cut in the year 1281. After that, nothing. No new beams, no new rooms. And this is not one lucky beam or a single stray reading. Archaeologists have now dated thousands of beams from well over 100 sites at Mesa Verde, cross-checked one against another, which is why a date like 1281 can be trusted at all. It is about as firm as a date can be in a country that kept no written calendar. The tree ring record of the building of Mesa Verde simply ends, in a single decade, like a sentence cut off in the middle. People were still raising walls in this canyon in the 1270s. By the middle of the 1280s, there was no one left to raise them. That is where the word in the title comes from, and you can feel why. Within about a generation, a countryside of tens of thousands of people that had been lived in and farmed and built up for 700 years went empty. The last inhabitants left the region around 1285, and within a few years more, the canyons were silent. 7 centuries of continuous life. And then, across the span of 20 or 30 years, gone. If you only had the buildings and the beams, and no way to think past them, vanished would feel like the honest word. But we can think past them, and this is exactly where I have to slow you down, because the leap everyone wants to make here is the wrong one. The tempting story is a single dramatic answer, and there is a real event sitting right there ready to be that answer. Douglas, when he read those tree rings, found something else in them besides the cutting dates. He found a drought, a long, brutal dry spell that the rings record across the Southwest running from the year 1276 to the year 1299. 24 straight years of poor rain, one of the worst dry stretches in the entire 2,000-year record the trees preserve. It has a name, the Great Drought. And look at how the dates line up. The last beam cut in 1281, the people gone by 1285, right in the teeth of a 24-year drought that begins in 1276. Douglas himself, back in the 1920s, suggested that the drought was the answer, that it dried up the corn and drove everyone out. It is clean, it fits the dates, and for a long time that is the version that got told. But here is where the careful archaeologists stop you, and where I want to stop you too, because the single dramatic answer is almost never the whole of it, and this whole video has been about not blurring the honest line. The drought is real, and the dates are real, but a drought alone does not quite explain it, for a simple reason. These were some of the most skilled dry country farmers who have ever lived. They had already survived droughts before. There was a hard, dry spell back in the middle of the 1100s, more than a century before the Great Drought, and they had lived through that one, and kept farming and kept building for another 5 or 6 generations after it. They had reservoirs and check dams and terraces built precisely to carry them across the dry years. A people that engineered water for centuries, that had already weathered a serious drought once and stayed, did not simply forget how to farm the moment the rain thinned again. Something more than thirst was at work, or the Great Drought would have finished nothing that 100 earlier dry years had not. So the leaving almost certainly had more than one cause. Several pressures landed together at the worst possible time, and the honest answer to why they left is that scholars are still weighing exactly how the pieces fit. So let me lay out the pieces, as the record actually gives them, without pretending any one of them is the master key. There is the Great Drought, yes, 24 years of failing rain sitting on top of everything else. But under that, There is the long, slow cost of 700 years of success in a fragile place. Farming the same mesa for centuries wears the soil down. Feeding and roofing and warming a population that size means cutting timber and burning fuel across generations, until the forests near the villages thin out and the land around a big settlement is stripped and tired. A crowded countryside, living close to the edge of what a dry land can give, is a countryside with no slack left in it when the rain fails. And there are darker clues layered in with the drought and the exhausted ground. In the last decades before the leaving, across the wider region, the archaeology turns tense. Villages pull back into the most defensible spots, up onto high mesas, and back into these very cliffs, which are, when you think about it, hard places to reach and easy to guard. And at some sites from this period, there is direct, grim evidence of violence and conflict among people under that kind of strain. I won't sensationalize it because it deserves sobriety, not a thumbnail. But it is in the ground, and leaving it out to keep the story pretty would be its own kind of lie. Put those together and the picture that forms is a deeply human one, and a surprisingly legible one. A large population that had thrived for centuries by working a dry land right up to its limit hit a stretch where the rain failed for a generation, on ground that was already tired, with forests already thinned and tensions already rising, and the whole system, which had held for 700 years, finally had no give left in it. Picture people who could see exactly what was happening to their land, and who made a hard, clear-headed choice to leave it before it took them down with it. That is what the evidence points to, and it is the opposite of a helpless mystery. Which brings us to the single most important fact in this entire story, the fact that turns the word vanished inside out. They left. They did not die out. They moved. Because a leaving implies somewhere to go, and there was somewhere to go, and they knew where it was. To the south and to the east of Mesa Verde, along the Rio Grande and its tributaries in what is now New Mexico, and out in the Mesa country to the southwest, the rain was more dependable and the rivers actually ran, so that is where they went. The great emptying of the Four Corners in the late 1200s was a migration, one of the large, deliberate movements of people in the deep history of this continent, out of a place that had turned against them and toward country that could still be farmed. They carried their corn, their pottery, their kivas, their way of building in stone, and their ceremonies, and they walked all of it into that new country, and they built again. And this is not a guess to make the ending feel kinder. It is something archaeologists can actually track in the ground. When you look at the towns that grow up in the river valleys of New Mexico and out in the Mesa country, in exactly the years after Mesa Verde empties, you find the same kinds of pottery, the same masonry, the same round kivas dug into the earth, and a population arriving from the north. The Four Corners does not simply go quiet while nothing happens anywhere else. It goes quiet at the very moment the towns to the south swell with newcomers coming down from the north. That is the shape of a migration, written in dropped pots and new walls. You can follow these people right out of one country and into the next, if you go looking for the trail they actually left. And here is the part that the spooky version has to leave out in order to work, because it is the part that ends the ghost story for good. The descendants of these people are alive right now. They are the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest. When those families left the Four Corners and moved down to the river country and the high mesas, they became, over the generations, the ancestors of the communities that are still there today. The Hopi in Arizona, the Zuni and Acoma in New Mexico, the many Pueblo towns along the river in New Mexico, places like Santa Clara and San Ildefonso and their neighbors, still standing, still lived in, some of them among the oldest continuously inhabited towns in all of North America. And in those towns, people still plant corn in dry ground, still climb down into kivas by a ladder through the roof, still hold ceremonies whose roots reach straight back into the world we have been standing in this whole time. That thread runs unbroken, all the way from these cliffs into those living villages. Those are not a vanished race. Those are the great-grandchildren, many generations down, of the people who shaped Cliff Palace into that alcove. This is why the word ancestral matters so much. The word I asked you to hold at the very beginning. Ancestral Pueblon. Ancestors of the Pueblos. The name itself carries the ending inside it. Those builders have descendants who can stand up today and point back across 700 years to the canyon their families came from. So go back one last time to that silent canyon and the two cowboys riding up on it in the snow in 1888, and the 600 years of quiet behind them. The silence was real. The alcoves really did empty, and the building really did stop in a single generation. The last beam cut in 1281, the last families gone by around 1285, and no one raised a wall in those cliffs. Again, that much of the title is true, but that silence never meant the people had ended. They had already left, and at that very moment they were hundreds of miles to the south and east, farming better watered ground, raising new villages, teaching their children the old ways of the corn and the kiva, in a country where the rain still came. The city in the cliff went quiet, because the people who built it were somewhere else, alive, and staying alive. And they and their descendants have been there ever since, right up to this morning. Before we close, if these old stories and the people who first wrote them down are what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. So, the next time you see a photograph of Cliff Palace, empty and golden, back in its great hollow of stone, I hope you see past the mystery, and past the word disappearance, to what is really in the frame. A city, a living people built by hand out of a cliff and a desert, and a home its builders were wise enough to walk away from while they still could, carrying everything that mattered with them, so that their descendants would be alive to remember where it stood.